Coming up on Folks, a look at Louisiana's Minority Procurement Participation Program, otherwise known as the Set-Aside Program. We'll take a look at the pros and cons of this controversial subject on today's edition of Folks. Hello everyone and welcome to Folks. I'm Sonya Masingale. We're continuing our look at the new Black agenda of economic enfranchisement today by examining the impact of one public policy designed to help minority businesses. Since Louisiana spends over $500 million a year on goods and services, state government is the largest consumer in the state. About 10 years ago, the legislature adopted goals to make the state a better customer for small business owners, minorities, and women. The Minority Business Enterprise Act of 1984 made it official that in the economic interest of the state, a fair and reasonable share of the goods and services purchased by the state are to be purchased from minority-owned businesses. Now, most people call the resulting programs set-asides, but we found that set-asides are actually just one part of the program. Whatever you call it, few government policies have attracted more controversy. And joining me in the studio to help us examine both sides of the controversy is C.J. Blache, a Baton Rouge attorney who works closely with several lobbying agencies and the Louisiana legislature, and Robert Holland, Executive Vice President of the Louisiana Homebuilders Association. Gentlemen, welcome to Folks.
Glad to be here.
I'd like to start with you first, Robert. With the Louisiana Homebuilders Association, what is your legislative stand on minority set-asides?
At this point in time, we have no official position. Our situation basically is the Homebuilders Association. We have not been in a situation yet where it's been something that's been brought directly to our attention. Some of our members, of course, do get into the commercial and industrial and of course, the public works arena. But at this particular point in time, the association as an association has not really met and discussed the merits, pro or con, for the set-aside program as far as an issue or a public policy stand.
How long has the Louisiana Homebuilders Association been an agency in Louisiana?
Since 1948.
1948, and they've never addressed set-asides?
I wouldn't say that they've never addressed it, but to my knowledge, as far as the situation that we're involved in here, there's no current history that I can put my hat on and say, this is the way we are or where we're at.
Okay, CJ, I've mentioned that you have worked with several different agencies. I assume that they are not all in opposition to each other on this subject. What is the general consensus about minority set-asides?
Well, when you say the general consensus, the fact that you have the passage of legislation which in fact provides for some type of set-aside, I don't like the term set-aside, but we will use set-aside, means that there is in fact a majority who believe that there is a compelling governmental interest in the state providing opportunities for small minority women-owned businesses to do business with the state. So I think the consensus is in fact a majority in support. But over the years of watching the evolution of set-asides, both nationally and here in Louisiana, you will find that there are many, many who are in opposition. I don't want to make it sound like the majority is some great vast majority, but there are many who are in opposition who just feel that you should leave it all to the market to determine. And the problem, of course, is that when you're talking about a market, you're talking about a market that is inherently flawed for the opportunities of some individuals to participate on an even field. And that's what this set-aside approach is about. It's about trying to allow a leveling of the fields for people to compete.
We'll find out later on today that the program is actually, set-asides are just a small portion of a larger minority procurement participation program. That takes a lot to say, and that's another one of the problems with the set-asides, is that nobody can pronounce minority procurement participation 3 times rapidly. I mean, it's not an easy program, it's very complex. Robert, from a more national perspective, why on earth would someone be against a program that sets a small amount of precedent for minority businesses?
I think probably because the perception, and probably rightly so, the perception is, as you just mentioned, is that there are flaws essentially in the system. I think the intention of trying to put together a program that will guarantee or provide certain guarantees to level the playing field, so to speak, sometimes has a tendency to work against the original intent. I think that there are probably abuses within the present system. Those abuses being, people, when rules are set, an inherent thing that usually happens is that people find out how to get around those rules. Example, my wife might be a minority, okay? Why can't I, as a contractor, kind of do a little bit of creative application to my organizational structure and put the business in her name? But she might not know a thing about what she's doing. The idea being is, what can you do to get around it? I think that is perceived as part of the flaws of the system. Overall, I think that we have to all be cognizant of the fact that we must work together to try to develop whatever is going to be the most equitable system. I think that the reason that you see primary opposition to set-aside programs is because people are aware that there are some types of flaws within the process and within the system that sometimes tends to be counterproductive and has a tendency to work against what the original intent was really meant to do.
Well, whatever you think about it, the program hasn't worked all that well in most places, and unfortunately Louisiana is one of the ones where it hasn't worked all that well. CJ, is front companies a problem that we're seeing more of in Louisiana? It was a problem in Atlanta, Georgia, but we haven't heard that much about it here.
It's not the problem that has been experienced at again, as what occurred in Georgia and at some instances at the national level. But the big problem here is, you've heard for years that we've had a 10% set-aside goal, where in fact the most that has ever been achieved in those goals, from my understanding, is 2%. So it's almost like a misnomer and a misunderstanding of most people that there is not in fact 10% that's just set aside and is restricted to minorities.
Okay, we're going to get a little more detailed into that a little bit later, since you are an attorney and you can give us a legal perspective on front companies and how that works. But first, let's take a look at the Minority Procurement Participation Program. The state of Louisiana is the largest purchaser of goods and services in the state. Just how and where the state government money is spent has a major impact on the economy of the state. About 10 years ago, minority set-asides were created as only one part of an effort by the Louisiana legislature to address the needs of minority and women business owners. According to a report from the Governor's Task Force on Minority Participation in State Procurement, Louisiana has the 14th largest minority business population in the United States, contributing some $600 million to Louisiana's economy. Yet the percentage of goods and services awarded to minority-owned firms has rarely gone over 1%.
Prior to my coming aboard, again, we don't have a lot of historical data in our files that we assumed from previous administrations. It just hasn't been, there hasn't been good record keeping, or as good as we would have liked to have. One of the major problems with the program is making sure that it is an economic development tool, Sonya. That's very important. And it's important even more so now with the recent Supreme Court decision in Richmond versus Croson. But the perception of the program has not been as favorable as it could have been. The program has not operated to its fullest capacity that it should have been in the past. And in that vein, the Governor Romer appointed a task force on minority participation in state procurement to look at the problems with the program.
One of the main problems with the program is its complexity. There are 3 phases to the Minority Procurement Participation Program. One is the set-aside, a term that refers to a contract designed for competition among minority businesses only, if 3 or more minority businesses can be identified to bid. 2 is the preference contract, where the state cannot identify at least 3 minority-owned businesses for competition on a set-aside contract. If the minority business bids within $10,000 or 10% of the lowest bidder, the minority-owned firm has the option of matching the low bid in order to get the contract. And the third method is direct purchasing, which can be used by state agencies for small purchases under $250 from any business, whether minority-owned or not.
State agencies are mandated to procure 10% of their goods and services with minority-owned firms. Now, how is that 10% achieved? It's not achieved from the total amount that is appropriated to a state agency, but it's achieved from what's called their adjusted fiscal budget base. What is their adjusted fiscal budget base? Their total budget minus non-recurring items such as salaries or electricity or rental for office space. Those type of items are backed out of their budget and they come up with their adjusted fiscal budget base. From there, that's the 10%.
10% sounds like very little. Does that 10% goal mean that minority business owners are not welcome to compete for the other 90%?
No, not at all. It just means that on the other 90%, they have to compete as a regular business along with minority-owned firms. And that is very much encouraged, that you should go after contracts that are not under the procurement participation program, but are just direct regular contracts that are issued by the state. And they very well are encouraged to participate on those.
Another problem with the minority procurement process is the registration certification procedure. The business owner must complete several complicated forms and provide a staggering amount of information about himself and his company, including a certification resume, articles of incorporation, company balance sheets, federal income tax statements for 3 years, resumes of corporate shareholders and key employees, an organizational chart, equipment ownership documentation, and official copies of birth certificates of the minority owners indicating racial heritage.
Other businesses don't have specialized programs. This is a specialized program, and to participate in this program, you do have to prove that you are a minority-owned business. If you want to compete for regular contracts, you don't have to go through that procedure. But if we are to ensure that minority-owned businesses are taking advantage of programs that are specially designed for them, and front companies aren't coming in here taking the 10% that has been allotted to a particular group of business owners, then we have to try to make that determination. If we aren't sure about that determination, then we won't be able to assure that the 10% is being targeted to the business community that it was intended to. And there has been a problem with front companies.
Just how common is the abuse of the minority procurement program by front companies?
We don't have any statistical data on how in-depth the problem is, but there has been instances of it. Our program hasn't gotten into full investigations of companies, but if we find that there is some discrepancy when we review their applications or when we renew their applications on an annual basis, then we have the ability to take away their certification.
Problems aside, the minority procurement program is here to stay for the time being.
One of our major goals is to ensure that top-level administrators in the state get the message that the Romer administration wants this program implemented, and I think that we've been successful in getting that message to them, and that is especially relevant by the results of the reports that we're receiving and the requests for assistance in developing annual plans for minority participation in the state from the agencies.
The Atlanta Journal-Constitution recently conducted a Southern poll. The poll included 12 Southern states, including Louisiana, and showed that a significant number of blacks did not approve of preferential programs to make up for past discrimination. My guests today are here to present opposing views on the minority preference programs, or are they? The first question goes to Mr. Blache, and that is, In the Southern Journal poll, for example, there was an indicator that even black people, professional people, just across the board, and a good number, I would say close to 40%. I wouldn't want anybody to quote me on that, but I do have a copy of the poll, did not approve of affirmative action programs, including minority set-asides. Are you hearing a similar sentiment in the state of Louisiana?
Sure. I mean, you're going to get different views on almost any subject. I think that's just a sign of the emerging diversity that you're going to find in the black community. But at the same time, personally, I believe that there is, in fact, a need for affirmative action type programs. I don't believe that the course of time will correct a lot of the problems that have been experienced in the past. I think that, as I'd stated previously, that there is a governmental interest to be served by utilizing tax dollars drawn from all citizens to try and address the cycle of poverty that's being experienced in a higher percentage among a particular group within a given community. Take Louisiana, for example. 35% of the population thereabouts is black. Economically, I don't have the actual statistic, but I would dare say that we represent less than 10% of the overall economic activity of the state and the private side, and I think I'm being liberal when I say that. And if you're going to try and break the cycle of poverty and give opportunities to minority businesses, I think that the state is going to have to get involved. It'll have to be the public sector to help out, because it's just super difficult on a private side to be able to break in to do business in the mainstream. I've had opportunities in my life educationally and professionally, and yet I still experience impediments out there in trying to compete with similarly situated majority attorneys. So I firmly believe that there is a governmental interest. I think there is a need for the program, and that we are not, in fact, going to change the economic ills within the minority community without trying to provide such opportunities.
Robert, with those who oppose minority set-aside programs, and again referencing the Atlanta Journal poll, there must have been some 60-odd% overall who disapproved of minority preference programs. Why would they oppose that?
My guess would be, without trying to put myself into their shoes,
okay,
or read, what was on their minds at the time, but my guess would be that they probably are opposed to the stigma. Once again, as you develop a program that's supposed to ultimately provide an overall fairness to it, you still create a stigma. And the stigma is of being a minority, when everybody's goal is to be a part of the majority. I think we have to understand that in this country is made up of minorities. It always has been to begin with, no matter where you were from. If you remember during in the early days when the Irish immigrants first came into this country, they were considered a minority by a number of people, and in fact some parts of the country they are looked upon as a minority, and there are certain discriminations and there are certain arenas of unfairness, so to speak. Why would people want to be opposed to continue to be corralled, so to speak, and put there? I think is a very good question. The system isn't ready yet. The system isn't right yet. We have to work on the system in order to improve it. And so that, to me, would be probably the reason why there would be that type of opposition, particularly among the minorities, as to the situation. They don't want to be corralled anymore. They want the opportunities to go out there. The problem is, how do we get this side to match this side? And where's that equilibrium? It's a difficult question.
Here we are sitting just moments from the declaration of a black governor of the state of Virginia. It's mentioned that the court in Virginia, the Croson, Richmond versus Croson case, was one of the landmark decisions that started to chip away at minority participation in procurement programs the way they are conceived in some instances. I'd really like your perspective on that, CJ.
Well, I think that the Supreme Court's decision in Croson was not one that in effect said that these programs are wrong. What the court stated in there is the method in which they are constructed should be tied more closely to the actual experience of the minorities that the attempt to assist is being pointed to. So what it does, in effect, is say that there needs to be a study to determine if, in fact, what they have referred to as a disparity study, to determine if, in fact, there has been discrimination in procurement with regard to a given or identifiable minority group. Once that's determined, it should be attempted to determine at what level that discrimination has been experienced, and that the program should attempt, first of all, race-neutral methods of addressing the problems that have been experienced by these minorities, and if possible, if race-neutral methods are not in fact available, to assist. And when I say race neutral, sometimes the problems for minorities is in the area of capitalization and bonding, in those types of areas that preclude competing and participation. Then you could, in fact, establish some type of percentage. I know personally, and I think there's great merit to what Rob said with regard to the stigma of set-asides and affirmative action, and many people wanting to move away from these things. And I would like to believe that most minority businesses would like to compete heads up just as any other business. But in that type of situation, you are going up against businesses with a longer track record who can underprice because of just having a broader market in the private sector. So I'm saying, given all that, I think that absolutely the decision in the Croson case still provides and still indicates that there is this need, and I think that the programs that are being developed to address the court's dictates in that case are taking the right approach right now. Joint venturing, bonding assistance, and things like that.
I might add that Louisiana is one of the first states to launch one of the studies mandated by that Supreme Court decision, was the Supreme Court, the decision on the Richmond Croson case. And I understand from the Office of Women and Minority Business Enterprise that other states are contacting our state, contacting that office to find out, now, how are you doing this? What are you doing? And there will be many other states that are going to pattern their studies after what we do here. And I, for one, am very impressed with Governor Romer's impetus to keep things going, his force behind the program to find a way to make it work. But I just, 1% out of all of the minority-owned businesses in Louisiana, 1% is a pitiful amount. And Robert, the reason why you're here is that one of the largest state expenditures is on construction and transportation and development. I'm curious, what stand does your association take on affirmative action programs?
Well, first of all, I think that, I don't mean to evade the issue, because I think that our association supports very strongly affirmative action programs.
Okay.
We have minorities who are members of our association. Mm-hmm. I think the point that kind of being overlooked, and that has to do with the Supreme Court case, is the fact that the public arena, governmental arena, which makes purchase and so forth, has a public responsibility to make sure that they are spending taxpayer dollars, in a responsible manner. And the problem that's associated with that, as we look at this, is we need to be able to develop the kind of system that will allow those public purchasers, those public administrators who make the decisions, that they are able to get the best buck for the best dollar. That is where we have this head-on collision, as to whether or not there is fairness in the marketplace and if there's fair competition. And that's why the discussion concerning, a race-neutral policy. I don't know how that's done. I've heard proposals that have been put up and placed that you need to have a number rather than any consideration of who the person is even. I don't know what the answer is. All I can tell you is that there is a responsibility that the public sector has to the taxpayer. Now, I think the second issue is, and probably very strongly involving minorities, and I know it's something that our association is very involved with. We've been involved with the United States Department of Labor for years on a program called the Manpower Apprentice Trainingship Program. The issue at hand is that if you do not have enough qualified people who have the adequate minimum qualifications in order to, to fulfill this need, then you need to train more people. I feel very strongly that we are making those efforts. There's a very outstanding program with the Homebuilders Association in New Orleans. And there are other homebuilder associations, local associations across the country. In fact, our state used to administer a particular program until, as everybody else, we were into hard times. It makes it difficult for us to take these programs and keep them going. But that was an effort by the private sector, and it's a continuing effort by HBAs to try to, to remedy and rectify the problem. But the real problem, I think, is perceived as, first of all, there's a responsibility in the public sector to wisely spend taxpayer dollars. Secondly, we must make sure as a result of that that we are training, that we have properly trained, adequate people, that what we're paying for, that we're fulfilling that first need. Regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of gender, there must be, the people who are performing the work for the public sector must be qualified to do the job they've been hired to do. And that, I think, once we can get into those two issues, is where we're going to come up with some problems. I mean, there are some solutions. Excuse me.
Okay. CJ, I hate to keep putting you on the hot seat, so to speak, but it's hard to imagine that after hearing the kind of numbers that have been reported in different polls saying that blacks really are suspicious of preferential programs, that across the board, just regular people agree with the fact that there must be affirmative action programs, such as, and I have to add, minority set-asides come in under affirmative action type programs. That's right. Because once again, it's designed to make up for some past problems. And I just like your closing statement on the necessity of keeping these programs going.
Well, the reason why I firmly believe that it's of major import that we keep these type programs going, just to paint a simple picture, I don't go to the same church, the same social circles and clubs and the like that, say, Rob and my counterparts who happen to be white go to. I don't have the same opportunities to develop business in the private sector because you don't develop those relationships and the like. There are a lot of complaints about problems within the black community economically. We need to address them, and we need to address them not in terms of just being able to get a job here or a job there, but to be able to create our own businesses and create our own jobs and hire our own people. We pay taxes like everyone else. The tax dollars being collected, we talked about 1% going back. I'm sure we pay more than 1% of the taxes collected in this state. And all we're asking is that the state recognize the need to invest back into its base, and we are a major part of that base, to help develop it and break the cycle of poverty and give that opportunity. We're not asking to give business to unqualified minority businesses. We all would stand against that. The certification process has been implemented to make certain that these businesses are, in fact, minority-owned, managed, operated. I think that the safeguards have been placed in, and I think that there is a governmental interest, and I'll quote the court, a compelling governmental interest in investing back into the growth of the overall community. It's to the benefit of the future economy of the state to try and break that cycle of poverty.
Thank you very much for being here. We're out of time for today's program. Be sure to join us next week for another edition of Folks. Bye-bye.